Hey there, you're listening to Sport Coach Education, the podcast that explores coach training in all its various forms. I'm your host, Liz Byam. Let's get started. So welcome. I'm excited to have my first stranger on the podcast. Yeah. So Ash, why don't you tell us about your coaching journey? And it seems pretty extensive, so take as much time as you need. And I'm sure it starts with you as an athlete. So feel free to start there.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Liz. I'm excited to join you and be a part of this podcast. So I guess my journey started as a young professional athlete. So as a professional soccer player or football player, as we'd say in England, I kind of went through the ranks of my hometown club, Hull City. At the time, they're languishing in the lower levels of the football league. And then when I left school at 16, I was offered a youth team scholarship professional contract for 3 years. So that was to take me till I was 19. You're a full-time soccer player in that environment, trying to break through into the first team, playing for the youth team and the reserves, or the under-18s and the reserves. And then at the end of that 3-year period, you get a decision made on you whether you're going to get a full-time contract, a professional contract. Hull, unfortunately, turned me down for a professional contract. They said that the first team had a couple of promotions to the championship level at the time. So that's one below the English Premier League. So the kind of team, the first team was on the up and had not developed in kind of the same time frame that they expected. So I was unfortunately let go and not given a contract renewal. So that was my first kind of experience of rejection. And after kind of going through childhood and working and putting all this sacrifice into becoming a professional soccer player, I think it was the first time I really had what happens if I don't become a professional? What's my plan B? So one of my kind of processes while I was going through this transition, I was fortunate to then sign a professional deal with another team called Scunthorpe United. So I made my professional soccer debut, 19 years old. And then you're thinking, I'm in that moment of potentially making it. But because I'd had that kind of previous rejection, I'd understood at that moment I had to kind of think about a plan B and what happens if this isn't something that I'm going to earn a lot of money for and have a long career. So I started to go into coaching, and I ultimately got into coaching because some of the coaches in the professional realm that I had maybe didn't meet my needs from where I was. Looking back now, I understand why they coached the way they did. It was very kind of brutal. It was a brutal environment, I would say. It was very much you perform or you're getting kind of verbally abused, really. It was an interesting concept because it was all about winning. It was all about getting into that first team. And if you didn't perform and you didn't win, unfortunately, you got the wrath of the coaches. And it was a little bit of an old school mentality, but it was what kind of make or break type thing. Unfortunately, it broke me and I struggled with that. And I remember kind of going through my journey as a professional athlete thinking, is this the only way that you're made to feel? Is this the only way that it is to be done? And I remember kind of thinking as I was going through the transition from playing to coaching, how good would it be if there was a coach that uplifted you and gave you confidence? So that's why I got into coaching. So as I turned professional and signed for Scunthorpe, I was very fortunate to get a coaching role at the academy at Hull. Played there, gone through the ranks, got a youth team scholarship, got released, went to Scunthorpe, was playing kind of in their first team, made my debut, was coaching at Hull, and then tried to kind of wrap my professional career and then my coaching education processes and started to understand how to coach effectively. So it was quite a cool journey. Unfortunately, my time at Scunthorpe came to an end after my 18-month contract ran out, and I, again, didn't get a renewal. And then that was where my decision had to be made of kind of what my next steps were. Real plan B was, well, I don't think I'm going to make millions of dollars playing professional soccer anymore. I'm probably not good enough. I got to a certain level I got to for a reason, but now I've got to start focusing on kind of what my plan B career would be. And I got into coaching. So I went to the University of Hull. I enrolled in a degree, sport coaching and performance. I was a little bit older than kind of the incoming freshmen, if you like, the first years. I was like 2 or 3 years older than they were. I had extensive coaching background already because I've been coaching for 3 years at Hull. And then I went on this journey where I just delved into coaching. I started playing semi-professional soccer in England at a high level and played there for 10 years. And then just kind of wrapped this kind of university life, this coaching life and this semi-professional playing life together to try and create the best kind of pathway for me, if you like. And went through my 3 years of my undergrad. I went straight into a PhD program at the University of Hull. I did a PhD on coach education and coach educators, which is going to tie into some of the things that I'm sure we'll talk about today. And then kind of 27 years old, kind of finished my education from a PhD perspective. Was still playing semi-professional, and then was still coaching at the Hull Academy. I'd worked from like under 9s all the way up to under 16s and every age group in between. And then kind of had a decision to make about what my next steps were. And I continued coaching. I got a little bit of experience coaching as a player coach in the semi-professional realm. So I was an assistant player coach for the team I played for, Bridlington Town. And that was an insight how to kind of manage your playing plus your coaching. And then eventually I came over to Ohio in 2017 and stopped playing, and then just focused mainly on coaching and coach education. So that's kind of like my journey a little bit. So what brought me to Ohio was the job. So there was an assistant professor of instruction at Ohio University in coaching education that was advertised. And at the time, I'd just about to kind of retire from semi-professional soccer. At that moment as well, I wasn't actually coaching at Hull anymore. I'd made a decision because I started to become a full-time teacher back in England. So I was working in like a further education college, they call it. So I was teaching a kind of 16 to 18-year-olds in sport. They call it a kind of like a BTEC national diploma. So I was teaching those. I was also going through a transition in my own life where I was trying to figure out what my next steps were and what my full-time career would be. I had an opportunity to go into full-time coaching at the academy at Hull, or going to kind of like this teaching realm, and financially and stability wise, the teaching realm kind of made more sense to me at that moment in time. So I'd done that for 3 years after I finished my PhD, and Ohio had seen this job in advertisement for Ohio University. And I, just to preface this, I'd coached out in America in 2012. So I was out here doing a summer camp. First time I'd experienced America, and kind of fell in love with the place. I was in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania area. Really enjoyed my time coaching soccer at these soccer camps with these developing players, and kind of loved the lifestyle of what America had to offer. And ever since then, I was kind of always thinking about, how do I get back? Obviously, having a PhD was an opportunity for some doors to open. And when I started then researching kind of sport coaching programs and coaching education programs in the US, compared to the UK, there's not that many. Every institute in the UK at university level has a sport coaching degree of some sort. I think in America, it's more sports management. So when I saw Ohio University kind of apply this advertisement, I thought maybe I would be a good fit for it. And then I was fortunate enough to be offered a job interview. And came out here in 2017 for a job interview. Loved the campus, loved the people I was interviewed by, and thought maybe this is an opportunity for me to start a new life at 30 years old in America and go down the professor route. And I've kind of been here 9 years now and never looked back, really.
I like that story. Couple things. I am working on a paper right now where I've looked up 1,500 universities in America, their websites, and I've actually found over 500 coach education programs.
Nice.
Which shocked me, but that does include, it's mostly minors.
Yep, correct.
Yeah, minors, some certificates, and then majors, masters. And then a couple would maybe call themselves a PhD in coaching, but none of them actually are. And that's one of my big things. One of my ultimate questions is, would a doctorate of coaching be beneficial in the United States? Like, I know in the UK you can get them. So like, you're the perfect person to answer that question. Like, what do you think the benefit would be here?
Well, I think from a perspective of doing a PhD is in the realms of coaching, and I'm sure we'll get into this as we talk about kind of coach education over in the US. I do feel because of the lack of qualifications you have to be able to be a coach, there is a limitation, and it's kind of a fighting battle that I'm finding that I'm involved in, is that anybody who is interested in kind of facilitating or coaching youth sport especially, they don't have to have a single qualification. And in the UK, that's very different. So coming over here, I was a little bit shocked finding out that any parent volunteer can basically coach without any potential experience or qualifications or certifications in coaching, which I found kind of mind-blowing a little bit, because in the UK you cannot step on a field or a court unless you have the bare minimum qualification. And that bare minimum qualification isn't just doing an online kind of coaching education takes half an hour and then you're qualified. It's an extensive qualification where you get a level 1 or in England you have a UEFA D license to even get out on the field in soccer. So over here, it is interesting to understand the landscape. Obviously, it's a much bigger country than the UK. The organised sport element is absolutely incredible out here in terms of what opportunities there are for kids to participate in sport, whether it's recreational or competitive. So from that perspective, I understand why there isn't as much education, because it's hard to educate everybody that wants to coach and the amount of organised sport there is. However, when we look at kind of the research out there in terms of youth development and some of the issues that have gone on in the US, that they say that 70% of under 13s have quit a sport and the main reason is parental pressure and coach pressure, then that's a real problem. So from my perspective, having education for coaches, and I'm not saying it has to be at the PhD level, but having more coaches that are educated and having more
Yeah.
understanding of what it takes to develop athletes effectively is absolutely essential. And that's why I kind of am passionate about my job, because like you mentioned, a lot of institutes have minors, they have certificates, they have degrees. And our institute here at Ohio, we have all of that. We have a coaching education minor, we have a physical activity and sport coaching major, we have 3 kind of master's coaching degrees. We have one specific for soccer, which is fully online. We have another one that's for all coaches online. And then we have an on-campus master's degree as well. So I'm just trying to impact as many people as I can that enter these programs. And the majority of our student body here on campus, they are highlighting that they potentially want to go into high school coaching because they're in an education degree. And this coaching minor kind of helps because there's a lot of teachers coaching in that school district. And I know the NFHS do a good job at trying to educate the coaches through online kind of certification. However, I think there's got to be more in there in terms of educating coaches of how to help athletes develop. And one thing I do love about being over here in the US and coaching here in the US, my background has included coaching at the NCAA Division 1 level as an assistant women's soccer coach. I find that there is this emphasis on winning, but there's also this emphasis that we've got to develop to win. And some coaches kind of find themselves in a bit of a dilemma of, well, I want to develop these athletes because they're still within this kind of student athlete realm as a high school or a collegiate coach. However, I know my job's on the line. And if I don't have a good winning record, unfortunately, that means I might not keep my job. So there's this real finite dynamic between development and winning out here. And it's getting the balance right. And it's difficult for coaches. It's very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially in I was going to say your maybe more income producing sports and stuff, but
Yeah.
it's at all levels. Like my college crew coach was eventually let go because his record wasn't as good as the school would have hoped. So they brought somebody new in. I mean, he
Yeah,
had been there for a long time, but which honestly just made it more heartbreaking. But yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those where you try to do the right things and especially in an environment where jobs are on the line, livelihoods are on the line in terms of coaching, and athletic directors have to make decisions. And especially in revenue generating sports where they're in the media, in the limelight more so than maybe revenue generating sports. And I think one of the things that coaches still have a responsibility to do though is develop and nurture athletes at whatever age. I think it's easy to, especially in today's realm with professional collegiate athletics, just to basically have a big turnover of players and athletes because we've got money to do so. So we'll just get the best players in and we'll make it work. And I think through history, we've seen it doesn't always work like that in all sports and all environments. And I think coaches that have a due diligence and a due responsibility to whoever's in their program to nurture that individual, nurture those group of athletes in a way where they're going to develop technically and tactically and definitely physically, but also psychosocially. And I think the psychosocial element is something that I've got a real passion for and a real interest because that's the one thing I really struggled as an athlete. And I think coaches never really nurtured that well enough. Like I said, it was a make or break type of situation.
Yeah,
where
I was going to say, it doesn't sound like you had much nurturing at all. Yeah.
No. And I think the coaches that stand out to me are those that did nurture you, and that did make an effort to get to know you as a person and try to fulfill your needs. Obviously, there's still an expectation of performance, and performance is always an important element of sport. But then I've always felt like if I'm feeling in a safe environment, if I feel developed, if I feel nurtured, if I feel like a coach is trusting me and a coach wants to help me, I'm then going to feel more kind of psychosocially better. So then I'll perform better. And I think what the research suggests that the more someone feels psychologically safe, the more beneficial it is to their performance, the more confidence they feel, the more motivated they feel. So from that perspective, from a coach, it's essential that we do that to our athletes to make them feel more motivated and more confident. However, it's an issue potentially when they don't know how to do that and they're just used to the technical and tactical elements. And if someone doesn't do something well technically or tactically, then they give them negative reinforcement after negative reinforcement after negative reinforcement. That can have a real damaging effect on the psychological processes of athletes. And I think this is something that coaches need to be educated in, and it's something that I'm passionate about.
So is that a big part of your curriculum that you
Yeah,
teach?
yeah. So our kind of curriculum is holistic to be athlete centered, and within that athlete centered approach, the psychosocial element is at the forefront. And I think we have courses in human dynamics in sport, we have courses in psychology of coaching, and we have social dynamics, and it's about relationship building. And then we obviously have courses that develop leadership as well and management. And I think that's part of that process where management and leadership of athletes is essential, not just X's and O's of how to lead athletes, but the leadership of them soft skills, how to use transformational leadership effectively to inspire and motivate athletes to make them feel more psychologically positive. And then from that, what's the type of feedback that you're giving back to your athletes in order to make them feel more confident, make them feel that they are developing in the right way. Yes, there's a standard that we have expectations that athletes have to meet from a performance perspective. But I think one of the things that we have to understand as coaches is how to communicate effectively with those athletes. And each athlete's different. And I think sometimes in coaching, especially in team sports, it's really easy to wrap everybody into just the team. So we'll just treat everybody kind of the same way. And it's not always that way that you can be effective with that as a coach.
Yeah, I was thinking that when you said, like you needed the nurturing. Yeah, I've tended to thrive under those coaches that, tell me I'm not good enough, or I don't know what that says about me, but
It means you're
not,
resilient. That's what it means.
not that I would recommend that approach to coaches, but every athlete is different for sure.
No, and I think one thing that I highlight in our program and something that I've learned from my coaching career is because every athlete is different, you've got to understand the athlete and you've got to try and understand their personality. And I think one of the things that you've just highlighted, Liz, is that some athletes do thrive in that environment where they want to be told that they need to do better. And I've had athletes like that where I've give them kind of praise or I give them positive reinforcement and you see it doesn't connect with them. But then if you give them a bit of negative reinforcement and light a bit of a fire, they turn into this different beast. And sometimes, again, that's what some athletes need. Unfortunately, I did not need that as an athlete. I was, and some might say that's mentally weak and I was soft mentally.
Yeah.
And that's part of what that old school mentality was. But unfortunately, I think in an environment, where we're at right now is with mental health issues and with the development of athletes that's so essential with the way that, especially at the collegiate level, people can easily transfer in and out now, which never used to be the
Mhm.
case. I think it's an essential part of you as a coach to be able to nurture those athletes and understand what it is that they work best with the way that you coach them. And again, as a team perspective, coming from a team sport, I think you have a coaching mentality of how I would interact with the team as a whole. But that doesn't mean then I treat each individual the same way that I treat the team. I think I've got to individualize, I've got to differentiate, and that takes time. It takes understanding, it takes relationships to be built, it takes your leadership to be effective, and it also, and I think the biggest part of this is a coach has to have self-awareness and they have to have emotional intelligence. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've come across over the last kind of 10, 15 years in my coaching career and my kind of like academic career is the process of understanding yourself and understanding what works for you as a coach, but then knowing that you might have to adapt a little bit. Don't mean you have to change your philosophy, but adapting different coaching styles, different coaching methods, different coaching leadership opportunities based on the athletes that you're working with.
And continue to learn. There's always something else out there.
Absolutely.
it seems obvious, but it's just you brought up again how you did not get from your coaches what you needed. And don't you think it's interesting? People usually become a great coach because they want to emulate a coach they had that was really impactful on their lives, or the opposite, which it seems in your case, where you want to do the opposite of how you experienced it and make it better for the next generation of athletes. So you don't really get that middle ground so much. I feel like it's one or the other.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've had some really good coaches that I've modelled myself off for sure in my past, and my dad was one of those. So he worked in an environment at the Hull Academy where he was somebody that kind of I looked up to as a coach. I was then actually a player under him in the semi-professional realm at Bridlington, which was interesting as a young professional, like ex-professional coming out the pro game and going into a semi-professional realm with your dad, kind of your manager or your head coach. We had a lot of arguments and a lot of disagreements. But he was somebody who always seemed to, when you reflect on it now, he always seemed to interact with his athletes in a way to get the best out of them, and he didn't impact 100%. It's impossible to do that, but
Yeah.
I would say that the majority of the players that we had in that environment really respected him and kind of bought into his philosophy, and that's one thing I've taken from a role model, and I've had other role models where I've definitely looked up to how coaches have done things. However, on the other side of the house, I've had coaches that I may look at and I'm going, I can't and don't want to coach in that way because I know how it made me feel, which is really interesting though, because one of the coaches I had coming through the ranks at Hull was a coach now that I use a lot of his kind of terminology. So he used, this is one of the coaches that I really kind of struggled to connect with, and I felt he didn't really nurture me in the best way. Looking back now and seeing kind of why he did what he did, I understand it. And
Yeah.
he was, in terms of some of the information that he gave me as a player, like the best coach I ever had in terms of like what the information he gave me from a technical and tactical standpoint, but the way he delivered it was probably the worst I've had as a coach. So I've took a lot of his terminology and took a lot of his tactical knowledge and technical proficiencies and some of the activities he did and some of the sessions he ran, and I would literally take that because he was so good in terms of that element. But from the psychosocial element, he was probably one of the worst ones I had. So then I take a little bit from another coach that had a really impactful nurturing psychosocial kind of coaching process, and I try to amalgamate kind of all these different coaches and then formulate my own coaching philosophy. And that was a real interesting journey for me as a young coach, working at the academy, going through university, still playing semi-professionally, trying to kind of formulate who I was as a coach. And I look back now after being coaching now over 20 years, I think I look at my coaching kind of formulation of what I and who I am. And it's definitely changed from when I first stepped onto, as an 18-year-old, stepped out there and first started coaching under nines and knowing how to plan better, how to deliver better, how to communicate more effectively, and ultimately putting the athlete first. And I think when I first started coaching, I was putting myself first. I was like, well, I like this drill, so I'm going to run this drill. And not realizing that is that the best drill to run for the players. And I think that's something that you develop over time and with more education for sure.
We have talked about that on the podcast more, those like young coaches, not to put down a young coach, but there's something to be said about life experience, not even just coaching experience, but life experience in general. I mean, we learn from all aspects of our lives.
Absolutely. And again, I think we look at kind of coaching education from a formal perspective and then an informal perspective and non-formal perspective. And when you look at the formalities of coach education, a lot of the research has suggested that it's actually not impactful or beneficial sometimes. It's a bit false. And that was one of the things that I did my PhD on. It was kind of like, I've gone through some formal coaching education and yeah, it's helped me and it's got my license or my qualification. But actually, is it the most beneficial way of learning as a coach? And then kind of these informal and non-formal environments are where coaches really thrive, from doing and learning and doing wrong things and making mistakes. I'll be the first one to hold my hands up and say I'm not being the perfect coach, and I still aren't the perfect coach. I make mistakes in every single session. I make mistakes the way I communicate, But I think the biggest thing is like reflection on that. And like what you said, Liz, I think having some sort of life experience helps you reflect in a little bit better of a way, so that next time you can adjust or adapt your coaching based on what you did previously. And until you get that experience, and that's what I say to these young coaches in my classes, these are 18, 19, 20-year-old freshmen, sophomores that are taking an introduction to coaching class, and maybe this is their first step into coaching because there was a high school athlete or a collegiate athlete here at university. And I say the best way to get out there and learn how to coach is actually going out and coaching. And as soon as you get into that environment, whether it's working with 5 and 6 year olds in a recreation environment or shadowing a coach and being able to work in a high school setting as an assistant coach or shadowing a collegiate coach, until you actually get into that environment and start kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together from maybe what we've taught in class. My class has very, very little impact on you, but the experience that you go and get from the environment that you work in for the first time is going to have the biggest impact on you. But if you then can connect some of the issues that you might have dealt with in that environment to that class content, you are going to be a better coach, because then you can reflect a little bit more effectively. You can reflect on some of the issues or the situations that you felt yourself in as a coach, and then reflect it back on maybe what we've talked about in class, and then be able to connect the dots. And I think that's a way then you can start developing a little bit better. And then in the final piece is you need a mentor or some sort of mentorship, where that coach that you're working with or under in that first environment is someone that's going to assist you and help you and, again, nurture you. And I think that's an important piece of coach development, being out there practically delivering and making mistakes, but learning from those mistakes, just like an athlete does.
I had written down the question from a different perspective. You basically answered it. From your perspective, what was most impactful for you? Was it being a player? Was it your coach education? Because you're one of those rare coaches that actually had an undergrad in coaching or coach education. Or was it just your experience, just the getting out there and
I think
coaching?
I think it was everything. It was all wrapped in.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I learned quite quickly was, like I said earlier in the conversation, I took a lot from what I did as a player. So the activities I enjoyed, the drills I liked, the information I was given as a player when I was playing, and I basically did all that. I kind of copied a bit of copy and pasting in terms of like, oh well, I like this activity. I played centre midfield, so I used to love anything to do with possession and passing and attacking and creativity. So I was like, right, I'm just going to do possession sessions and passing sessions, and I thought, well, I don't really coach defending, I don't really coach kind of shooting, and I'm not coaching heading. And all of a sudden I recognized that I can't just do what I love to do, because I'm just going to create players that enjoy what I did.
Yeah.
And that's not how you're going to be successful as a team. So I'm sure there's
So
some players.
profound.
Yeah. So some players definitely enjoyed them session, but I can imagine a centre half who maybe weren't the best on the ball. They were definitely like, well, why am we do possession all the time. So I think one thing from my perspective that I then started to develop was, yeah, I went down the coach education route, and I think my degree and my PhD definitely helped me open up a little bit in terms of different coaching methodologies and what's the best way to implement coaching methodologies in your sessions and into your practice. But I think then I went through kind of licenses, so I got my UEFA B certification when I was like 20 years old. And again, that gave you a different perspective of how to set sessions up, how to think tactically, how to give demonstrations more effectively. But I think the biggest thing where I really developed was at Hull as an academy. We had a group of coaches at one point from, I think it was like 2010 to maybe 2014, where we had a really good group of coaches, and we all learned from one another. And the head of the academy at the time, we have to do these like development days where you would basically work with your coaching staff. You'd bring one age group in, and then on a Sunday morning, coaches would coach that age group and do loads of different sessions based on a topic that you were given, and you had to plan for it. And then the beauty of it was these coaches who were all in the same realm of this high-level academy coaching system that want to produce these players to the first team, that are trying to develop their own coaching skills, and they're all at different ages. We had over 60s to myself, who was kind of 20, 21, 22 at the time. And what we ended up doing was just giving feedback to one another, but it was done in such a really unique way where it wasn't, or someone struggled, so we're just going to kind of tell them how bad they are. It was like, right, have we thought about maybe adding this on? Have we thought about maybe progressing the session in this way? What was your thought process behind even delivering a session like that? What is it that you want to get out of it? And all of a sudden, what I realized was we created this community of practice where we was able to develop from one another in a really healthy environment where you could learn from one another, watch one another, communicate with one another. And that looking back, that was probably the most enjoyable time I've had in coaching, because we were surrounded by like-minded people that all were highly qualified, all come from different backgrounds, but all played a certain level of soccer. And ultimately, our number one aim was to develop these players to get us into the first team. And I look back now, and these kind of 6-7 coaches that we had in that time frame, if you look to where players are that have come through that system within that kind of 4-year range, I think Hull had produced more professional soccer players than they had previously and than they have done recently because of this group of coaches. And now one of these coaches is the national manager of Sweden. He's been managing and coaching in the English Premier League, the Swedish Premier League. So that was a level that we had as a group of coaches. We've got others that are working at high level in academies. And when I look back in that realm, my goal or my dream was to work full time in a coaching academy, and that's all I wanted to do, and that's all I knew. I was 22, 23 going through school, and all I could think about was I want to finish my school, and then I need to get on my career, and I want to get a job here at Hull or wherever, and basically coach full time and nurture these kids to get into the first team. Life changes a little bit, and one thing that I realised was that, unfortunately, in the UK, which is very different to the US, is financially coaching is, especially at the youth level, is not a very rewarding or very sustainable profession. And even though you're coaching some of the best some of the best players I've ever coached, and I was on like $10 an hour, and then you come over to the US, and the way the system's set up and the pay-to-play model, you've got coaches that are earning $80,000, $90,000 in certain states and certain cities across the US coaching youth soccer, and you're just like, this is phenomenal, but then the level's nowhere near the level that you was at. And so that's part of the process where the land of opportunity in America is there is the opportunity, there is the pay structure in youth sport where people can go in, but you've got to do it in the right way when you get into that environment. There's certain clubs out here that are doing that right now, especially in the soccer realm that I know about, where they're really developing players, getting well paid to do it. They're doing it in an environment where they're producing players that go off to collegiate sport and collegiate soccer especially. And some of them then end up going in the pro game. So it's a fantastic kind of model if it's done well and done right.
It is funny that you say coaches are paid well, because that is, especially youth coaches, probably one of the biggest roadblocks for coaches. I mean, you could be really passionate, you could be an outstanding coach, but ultimately you have to move on or it's your side hustle, because a lot of people can't make a living wage off of coaching. So maybe soccer is the sport to be in.
Yeah, and it's got to be in certain environments as well. Big cities that are thriving communities with kind of well-off parents. And unfortunately over here, soccer can be classed as a middle-class sport. You know, I think it's a sport that maybe isn't equal opportunity for everybody, and it's the way that they've utilised this as a development process with club soccer out here. When then you see collegiate soccer and what that looks like, you get a lot of individuals that have come from a really affluent background. But that's just one sport in one area and one environment. But yeah, you're right. It is a roadblock for most. And going back to kind of my experience in England, it was exactly the roadblock that unfortunately didn't allow me to develop and go into that full-time realm, because, and just as an example I'll give you is I had the opportunity to move into kind of my dream job. So my dream job, when I finished my PhD, I remember I was 28 years old. I was teaching full time at this further education college to basically have money coming in, have a salary after being in school for 7 years. And I remember just about to kind of make a decision on whether I could continue working for Hull as a part-time coach with a full-time job and still wanting to play semi-professional soccer, which I did at the time because I was 28 and still felt I was in my prime a little bit, minus the injuries that I always had. So I remember sitting down with the head of the academy at the time and him highlighting, hey, look, there's this job coming up. It's for the under 12 to under 16s, assistant coach for the development phase. And I was like, that is my perfect role, working with these 12 to 16-year-olds, working in a full-time environment to develop these players to go on and hopefully produce in the first team. And I remember sat down and kind of highlighting kind of what the package would be. And he kind of highlighted the money, and he said it would be £18,000 to be a full-time staff member. And at the time, I'm on £30,000 as a teacher and working 40-hour weeks, Monday to Friday. And then the hours, as we know, in coaching is very unsociable, evenings, weekends. And he kind of mentioned, well, it's at minimum 60 hours a week. And then I had a house and a mortgage at the time. I was kind of like, started doing the maths. I could not take a £12,000 pay cut to become a full-time coach at that time in my life. It'd have happened 4 years earlier. I'd have snapped his hand off and said, yeah, that's where I need to be. But 27, responsibilities, mortgage, house, whatever it was, all of a sudden then you're kind of in a crux where financially that became the barrier, where you had to go into a realm that you felt was stable. And me going in the realm I went to and the pathway that I chose, which was to stay into teaching, has actually helped me in terms of where I am right now. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I always look back and I think, what happens if I did take that pay cut? What happens if I did go into that realm? And what would I be like now? Where would I be right now? I probably wouldn't be here at Ohio University. I know that. So it's really interesting, these options you have. And I think from a financial standpoint, young coaches especially, I think sometimes you have to sacrifice the finance to be able to coach. But like you mentioned, Liz, for certain people, it does become a side hustle. It's not a profession in terms of, and this is where maybe we go back to that PhD comment, it's not a profession where people then would go and get a PhD and know they're going to get well paid for it. But when you look at the opportunity that they're out there with the organised sport, and some sports that are definitely high paying, pay to play, there are opportunities in certain areas where coaches can get well paid and it becomes their career and their profession. But like you say, it's unsociable hours. It can impact families. It can impact relationships. I know firsthand because my brother's out here in the US and he was a soccer coach on that amount of money in Manhattan and earning a lot of money, but never seen his kid, never seen his wife. And he knows many other English guys that have come across and kind of struggled and done the same. And unfortunately, it's cost them their personal life for their professional career. And one thing that I started to develop and think about in my career was, how do I balance this? I want my passion of my professional career, but I also want the balance of my personal life. And unfortunately, we have to then make decisions on what's the best pathway for each individual. And there's some coaches that are like, no, this is my pathway. And hopefully they've got an individual or a relationship or a spouse or a partner that supports them. And you see that in collegiate settings for sure, especially when they're moving here, there and everywhere. But then you look at collegiate settings where there is potential money, and you do have that financial reward. And unfortunately, in coaching, we put a lot of emphasis on youth development and how important it is to develop the youth setting. But financially, we don't pay the coaches well enough in that environment. So then the youth of today maybe don't get the best coaching, maybe don't get the best development, maybe don't have those passionate coaches. And then they end up, for whatever reason, because they develop themselves or they get a good coach, they end up in that collegiate setting where then they've got a coach that's on potentially thousands or millions of dollars in the US, right? And then how is that coach nurturing that athlete? And it's just crazy when you think about the pathways that athletes have and the opportunities that they have and how impactful coaches are in that pathway and that journey. And if they're very lucky and they get a good coach that can help them, that's passionate, then they're the ones that normally get nurtured and normally then go up the pathway and potentially get into that professional or collegiate realm.
Your story reminds me of myself in college. I was an exercise science major and on the crew team, and my goal was to be a collegiate rowing coach. That was my plan. Then towards the end of school, my boyfriend was a grade above me. He graduated and became a rowing coach. He was making $17,000 a year as an assistant rowing coach at Rutgers. And I will say the women's coach made more because of a whole Title IX thing,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the men had a heavyweight and a lightweight program, so they had to split the money. But yeah, he made peanuts, and I made the decision we can't both be crew coaches and survive. So I went on and got my MBA. I was like, I'll do the corporate thing because somebody has to make money. Now it
Yeah.
didn't work out with the guy, and I hate the corporate world. So
And then 180 circle and back.
yeah,
Yeah, love
basically.
it.
And I'm gonna have him on my podcast because he ended up coaching at Navy for 20 years, and now he's an athletic director there.
Awesome. So again, sometimes that sacrifice as a young coach, not earning a lot of money, can eventually turn into a role where they make a career out of it. And your ex-boyfriend, as you just mentioned, end up going down that pathway, making a lot of sacrifices. And now, if you're an athletic director, you're probably earning good money at some point, you know.
Yeah.
But it's a long journey, and I think it's interesting because I get a lot of young coaches in my classes that like, I want to be an athletic director, and you kind of like, that's awesome, but most athletic directors have been coaches for many years, and it's that kind of sacrifice you make. And I utilize like the coaching world very much like an athlete, where they have to make certain sacrifices. They have to make decisions along the way of what their next steps might be, and sometimes they question whether it's all worth it. Right? We've all been there as an athlete. Is it worth it? Especially when we're in the higher elite realms, and which we've both been at. You have doubts, and I think it's the same within the coaching journey. Right? It's a process where coaches get into coaching at normally a young age for a specific reason, or coaches come into that environment at a very later date because of their kids, potentially, where then they want to help their kids develop and then go down that route. And I think eventually there's sacrifices have to be made. And one of the biggest sacrifices, unfortunately, in the coaching realm is financial, until you're able to put the hours in and maybe then get the job. And we have graduate assistants here in our program at the master's level where they are on peanuts and they're doing 90, 100 hours a week, which is ridiculous for that process. But they know that them doing that amount of hours is going to get them the recommendation that's going to get them the first assistant coaching role. And then if they can thrive in that environment and love that environment like they are doing right now as young graduate assistants, then you're on the fast track to becoming a full-time coach. And if you're in a revenue generating sport like football, basketball, and you've got a good opportunity of earning money. And it's interesting because we've got graduate assistants that have come through our program, and 24, 25-year-old graduates that then have been hired by the collegiate teams here. And all of a sudden they've jumped straight from whatever their graduate assistantship stipend was onto 60, 70, $80,000 in that environment. I'm like, you're on more money than me. This is unbelievable. This is awesome for you. So certain sports look after their coaches. And as we know, rowing and maybe other sports, unfortunately, maybe
And
not
not so
so
much.
much. It's that revenue generation and where the money from athletics goes, and it it's not equal across the board, unfortunately. So we understand, depending on what sport individuals are in, there are potentially more financial sacrifices have to be made, especially potentially in rowing and even in soccer, in the women's soccer realm here. The assistant coaches, I think they're on like $40,000, which is a lot more than what your ex boyfriend was on at
Yeah.
$17,000, but $40,000 in today's climate is not a lot of money, right? But it's livable because people do it, and some people then coach on the side as well in club and earn a little bit of money in club. But then literally all you're doing is coaching. You're coaching, and it becomes your life. Now again, that's the sacrifice that potentially
Yeah.
you have to make.
Yeah, going back to that like career life balance.
True.
And yeah, the sacrifice for peanuts, as I keep saying. I'm going to circle back to like 10 different things. But one is the story you were telling about the coach who was not nurturing, but had all the X's and O's, was good at, I think you said, or I assumed, like spotting errors and fixing them, things like that. You said your description was a lot more elegant than my recap right there. But which one do you think is harder to learn? Like, would you rather somebody come to you like that because you could teach them the soft skills? Or do you think somebody coming in with good soft skills and it's easier to teach them the X's and O's?
I think in my perspective on my role as a professor, it's kind of those individuals that want to get into coaching know their sport, so they know a little bit about the X's and O's of that sport. So my majority of students that I'm educating are those that need maybe those soft skills to be developed and nurtured. And like I said, in our undergraduate coaching minor, we have a lot of education majors that are going to be teachers.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that again they're going through in their process and their development is how to teach. And I think in coaching it's exactly the same, but it's not just teaching content; it's connecting with people. And teaching and coaching are the same, except just done in two different contexts. So I'm I'm always of the understanding that you ultimately want to become a coach because you love your sport and whatever sport that might be. So because you know your sport, you've got their X's and O's, you understand it, you've probably played that sport. So the majority of my kind of time and kind of thought process is related to them softer skills. But then I do get the odd student, and this is mainly in the masters programs where I've had soccer coaches, especially where they didn't play soccer. They they don't really know much about soccer, but all of a sudden now they've got a kid that's obsessed with soccer, and they've had to then pick up that as a volunteer coach, fell in love with the game, obviously want to help develop their son or daughter, and then they come into our program like, hey, look, I have done this in my past. Some might have been teachers, the majority of are. Some might have been in the corporate world. Some might have been in whatever profession. But now they're like, I need to develop these X's and O's. I need to understand the game of soccer. So it's just bringing their thought process through of kind of the basics of the game and allowing them to understand what activities can be really effective. And that's not just in soccer, but it's in all sports as well, because we do get some individuals that come into our online master's degree where they are in the same boat, but it might be for a totally different sport where their son or daughter is really obsessed with that sport and they want to learn that sport to help them out. So they're kind of like the minority, if you like, in terms of what we have to do with. So then I'm having to kind of think about X's and O's. Now, when it's soccer, that's easy for me because I know the X's and O's. When it's a different sport, then that can be a little bit more difficult. But again, I think it's one of those where I would always advise those type of coaches to go and get a mentor within that sport that knows them X's and O's a little bit more. And I'd still focus more on the soft skills of relationship building. And the big thing is leadership. I think it's how you lead as a coach, how you manage as a coach, and how you're self-aware as a coach to be able to develop your athletes in front of you and understanding the way I'm coaching has an impact on those in front of me. So if the way that I'm coaching is impacting those in front of me negatively, I have to change and adapt the way I'm doing something to try and impact them more positively. And I think once coaches understand that a little bit better and they've got a little bit more self-awareness and can understand what they're doing to those individuals in front of them, then they've got an opportunity to develop and be a better coach because they can self-reflect.
So I think I know your answer, but do you think it's necessary to have played the sport that you coach?
Depending on the level, I think if you want to be at the highest level, then you need to have had some experience playing. I do think though it's not the be all and end all just because somebody hasn't played that sport. I don't think that stops them fully. I think you've got to immerse yourself in that sport and learn everything around it. So I think that's important. And I take the example, imagine like myself, who's been involved in soccer for all this time. If all of a sudden I had a kid and they potentially fell in love with basketball, as an example, and all of a sudden I wanted to help them and become a basketball coach, I do feel I'd be able to coach basketball even though I can't shoot or can't dribble or can't pass because I never grew up with it. But one thing is, I would learn the X's and O's of basketball. I would immerse myself in that sport, and then you'd use your experience that you've got in life and my experience that I've got in coaching to be able to coach effectively in that sport. And I think one of the things that the students sometimes find kind of shocking is when I don't run soccer sessions and I'll like demonstrate how to coach a session in a different sport that I've never played, like volleyball or basketball or football or field hockey or whatever it might be. And even though I might know the very basics of some of the skills, it's the way I can still develop and deliver the session so that it becomes effective. And again, that's because of my knowledge and my experience in coaching and knowing what an effective coaching session looks like. And it's about how the athletes learn in that session. So it's not about sometimes how the session looks. It's about the impact that you're having on the athletes. And I think sometimes coaches really struggle to differentiate between the two. And I remember as a young coach, again, that the cleaner my session looked and the more like aesthetically pleasing it looked to parents on the sideline, then I was a great coach. But actually with the kids learning, I've learned now the messier it is, the more decision making involved, the more game realistic it becomes, the more errors that are involved. That's when real learning takes place. And then you as a coach has to facilitate that. And you can facilitate that in a million different ways. It might be one way you step in, you freeze the situation, you demonstrate the situation. Another one might be, hey, right, you've got two teams going on, split off in your two teams, have a conversation about what's working versus not what's working. Another one might be that you ask him some questions. If you was in this situation here, what might be a better decision-making process? Where might someone need to go to help you? So all of a sudden, one thing I've learned as a coach is how you deliver your message can be done in so many different ways. But as a coach, you have to have a toolbox of all these different methods to impact the kids, because not all kids or all athletes are effective when you just tell them. And not all athletes are effective when you put them in a team and get them to discuss. So the more varied method and coaching ways you can do things, you're going to impact more people in front of you. And I think that's one thing where then, if you know how to do that, I don't think it matters what sport you're doing it in, as long as you've got a grasp of the sport and an understanding of the technical and tactical elements. So coaching is an ability. It's a skill. It's how you get people to learn in that environment through what you do as a coach by facilitating, leading, and managing in that environment.
You said it before, but everything you just said is so teaching and learning focused. And I would totally agree. I've been put in that position where I've had to coach sports that I knew nothing about. As with yourself, like I'm a conscientious person. I'm not going to just show up there and not have done a little homework and figured out, even if it's, I coached rec basketball, like I had to figure things out. I actually coached middle school soccer without having ever been to a soccer game in my life. So, and that team went the furthest they'd ever gone.
Awesome. And it just shows, though, Liz, I think it just shows that it's not always about the X's and O's. It's,
Yeah.
yes, you have to have a little bit of understanding. And again, the level you're at. But especially in the youth realm, if the kids listen and understand what you're trying to say and you deliver the message in a way that they understand it, I think all of a sudden then you can get impact, you can get development, you can get potential improvement. And that's the most important thing. Did they learn something through whatever activity or whatever session you delivered? Did they learn something from the game that they played in, the scrimmage that they did? And if it was something that not so good, can they fix it themselves, or can you help them fix it in a way that makes them feel positive about themselves? Or can they fix it themselves to develop and improve the next time they're in that situation? And I think that's ultimately what that teaching or coaching and learning is related to. And it goes back to that coach I mentioned before, where when you think about the what and the content, like unbelievable. The content he was able to give us as players was the most finite detail ever. And I use a lot of those details in my soccer coaching, like terminology, my soccer coaching philosophy.
Did that coach know where you are in your career right now?
I think he knows how much he influenced me,
Okay.
both positively and negatively, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. No, yeah.
Yeah, he did.
He definitely did, but I was wondering if he knew. So that's
Yeah, he
cool
does
that he
know.
does.
He does know, yeah. So I think the thing from his perspective was the way he delivered that content was just like incredibly detailed. The way he delivered it though was something where I at that time didn't resonate with. So what was in his mind and the way that he tried to communicate that information sometimes doesn't resonate with the players in that environment. And I think looking back now, probably it was a fault of both of ours, right? It was a fault of the coaches for not checking the player understanding. And it was also a fault of the players kind of putting a barrier up and going, well, I don't understand that. And instead of asking questions, then maybe would have been better off. And maybe I would have been better off by asking certain questions. Hey, what did you mean by this moment. Unfortunately, the way he maybe coached us, he didn't have that approachability for us to do that.
I'm sure it
So
didn't.
so all of a sudden then it became like this kind of um balancing act that I've tried to implement in my coaching. I'm like, right, I've got certain information in my mind. Can I deliver it in a way that the people understand who are in front of me? And if they don't understand it, it's not their fault, it's my fault. So I now need to change the way I deliver my information. And I do that as a teacher quite often. And I think sometimes when I get on a bit of a passionate rant, my accent comes out a little bit thicker. The people here in the US, definitely in my class, kind of might struggle to understand me. So one of the things I try really hard to do, and it's just a self-awareness thing, is if I see kind of glassy-eyed or
Mhm.
people in front of me where I'm like, they don't understand that, or I'm asking them to do a task, maybe when I'm coaching my session and they just don't understand it, I'm like, well, hang on, that's on me. Stop. Right. Let me rephrase that. Let me change the way that I've delivered that. And I think, again, that comes that self-awareness. And that's got nothing to do with X's and O's. It's all about
Right.
how you deliver it. So it's an important element of coaching that it's never really taught. And like we teach on coaching education classes, especially sports specific ones, X's and O's, tactics. We don't really talk about the softer skills of how to communicate effectively. And that's where, going back to your question, do people need a PhD? Well, maybe they don't need a PhD, but if they can get educated in how to be a better and more effective communicator, if they can be educated in how to reflect better and understand social relationships and understand management and leadership styles and the impact of those management and leadership styles, they are going to potentially be better coaches.
Well, and in my defense, I don't think all coaches need a doctorate, but I do think the people educating coaches. Now, you're kind of one of the exceptions because even in coach education programs at universities in the United States, the majority of the people teaching those courses did not have formal training in coaching. And coaching, as we've discussed, encompasses so many different things. So there are a lot of adjacent degrees and people tend to have, maybe it's sports psychology, things like that. But because there isn't a doctorate of coaching, we really don't have those professors who have that credential, maybe not experience is the wrong word, but they certainly don't have that credential because the credential doesn't exist.
Mhm.
I also think the more research, the better. It would help coach developers of all levels, not only people who work in universities. I think there are a lot more on the ground coach developers and where are they getting trained? So I would ideally hope that there would be a trickle down effect.
It's really interesting because when you talk about that, I think the pathway in coaching traditionally is you're an athlete of the sport, you then coach the sport, and if you're really good at coaching and you've coached for a long time, you then become a coach educator to educate the next generation, and that's kind of like the traditional pathway of what a coach may go through, and then a coach educator goes through. And one of the things that's been researched, and again based on information in the UK and my ties to the UK, the Football Association in England, they did a big revamp of their coaching education system because it was kind of broken. It was systematically producing coaches, but not producing coaches at the level that they wanted to produce them, which then had an impact on that we're not producing players to be at the national level to be successful in World Cups and European Championships. And they had a rehaul of their coach education system to try and basically develop coaches better. And then what they've done, and US Soccer have started to do this as well, now they're developing coach educators through more teaching processes. So they're putting on courses that are now developing the coach educators. Now, I'm not saying that the coach developers of the coach educators have a PhD or high level, but they might, again, had a lot of experience in coach education and done it for a long time. One of the things that was found in the UK was when you're coach educating a coach on a coaching license or a coaching program, you need to be a good teacher. And one of the things that they did in the UK was they revamped this coach developer course to have a lot more teaching elements, so teaching styles, teaching strategies, because basically you've become a teacher.
See, yeah,
Because
it seems obvious, and I'm glad they came to that conclusion. But yeah,
correct. And then what they did was those coach developers then started to understand how to teach more effectively, not just be a good coach. And then again, I think part of that process is how somebody who is educating coaches has to be a good teacher, because ultimately you're teaching people to potentially be a better coach. And one of the things that has definitely impacted my coaching journey. So when I finished my PhD and I moved into this further education college in the UK, and I was teaching these 16 to 18-year-olds in this sports science BTEC qualification. To work in that environment, you had to have a teaching qualification. Now, I had not got a teaching qualification because I'd gone from professional soccer into coaching soccer, into coaching as a degree, and then in a PhD where I was then interested in coach educators and what coach educators could do as their role in coach education. So as soon as I got into this environment, the first thing they said was like, yo, you've got to go and do something called a postgraduate teaching qualification. So I was like, okay, no problem. So I went and did that. It was formal. I learned more how to, yeah, don't get me wrong, I was teaching and coaching through my kind of career anyway, but I learned so much on that degree on how to teach effectively in a classroom setting. So then when I've come out to the US, part of my process is remembering kind of like, right, I'm a coach, but I'm also a teacher and I'm qualified as a teacher. So my sessions that I'm setting up in a classroom and the way I set up my practical sessions has an element of teaching in terms of like the setup, the plan, the differentiation, the processes, the styles that you use, the questions, the tasks, the progressions. And all of a sudden, I've just encompassed kind of both of those. So my advice would be for anybody that wants to get into anyone that wants to get into coaching, if you can get some sort of teaching understanding or teaching qualification, it's only going to benefit you as a coach. Now, the beauty of the way that American organized sports work, you can put the two together. You can work in a high school or a school district as a teacher and then coach as well. Now, all right, you might not earn the money from the coaching, but you can earn a lot more money from the teaching perspective. And that's what I love about the American system, that you've got a great opportunity through organized school interscholastic sport, where you can really have an environment where you nurture those individuals and student athletes. Now, unfortunately, though, what you learn from these programs in high school sports especially, they're still judged on winning and losing. But this is a 14 to 18 age bracket, the most important for development, physically, technically, tactically, and definitely psychosocially. Yet the AD and the parents and the community all focus on the win-loss record. And that to me is mind-blowing, but it just shows the American kind of way, if you like, which I'd love because it's competitive and it produces results in Olympics. It produces results in American sports for sure. It's just not produced American results for soccer worldwide yet. And hopefully it's getting better. But what's really interesting about soccer in the US, the women's soccer have its own pathway and it's been invested and it's obviously one of the best in the world, the pathway progress that they do. The male, unfortunately, is lagging way behind, and that's why they've changed in the MLS academies to a European structure. They've gone through academies, they've changed the structure, and high school and collegiate sport isn't a pathway really for soccer players who are men, but soccer players for women, totally different ballgame. It's the American way. And coming from the UK, I believe in the system. I think it's a really cool way to develop athletes to get professional pathways, because in the UK, you play one sport, and if you're good enough, you potentially can make professional, which I was fortunate to do. But it doesn't really give you the opportunity to do something else. It basically chews you out and spits you out and says, there you're on your own now, go figure it out. Where at least in the US, you might get to the collegiate level, you get an education, you come away with a degree. Yeah, you might not go to pro, but now you've got a degree, and potentially from what you've learned in that environment through your 23 years playing that sport is going to give you a leg up in life. So I
Absolutely.
love the collegiate system out here. I think it's got a real impact. I don't know how it's going to be in the future with NIL and everything that's changing the landscape right now, but it has had a massive impact on development of people that play at high level sport.
I think a lot of Americans don't realize that it isn't like this everywhere. I
It's
mean,
not like this
that's
anywhere.
like generally an American attitude about everything. No understanding of how anybody else does anything. But yeah, it's just the fact that athletics isn't part of the collegiate experience. I 100% agree with all your um, points about teaching. I usually ask, do you think I had an athletic director on, a high school athletic director, and I was like, do you think teachers make better coaches? And I would think absolutely. especially because we don't teach coaches those skills. I mean, if coaches were being taught the same kind of thing, then it wouldn't matter as much. And of course, you always have your, better teachers and better coaches than others. But yeah, I use my knowledge of teaching all the time. I also thought when you were describing the messy field, did you ever learn in your education programs that um, allowed chaotic classroom? The most learning is going on in there. People think, oh, if kids are sitting with their hands like crossed in front of them and just listening. I remember during COVID, all my mom friends were like, oh, my kid missed a year and this was covered and this was covered and this was covered and they missed it. And I'm always like, when you say covered, what do you think that means? Like, just because the teacher says it one time does not mean that any of that information was received or what was it processed? Was it used in a different situation? Like, how much of what's covered in schools you think your kid really comes away knowing at the end of the year? I see a lot of parallels with what you were saying, like that messy field.
Yeah, I think it's an important part of like that learning process, right? And how you as a coach can facilitate learning effectively in an environment. Don't get me wrong, there are times where you need that kind of telling and
Of
structure.
course.
But again, it's that varied process. If you have a messy process all the time, then potentially the kids might start losing motivation because they feel that they might not be developing because they're making mistake after mistake after mistake. And again, as a coach, I think about as a continuum, right? In terms of they call it the representative learning design, and I run a course on skill acquisition, and that's focused on technical development. But I think it can go through all development, through tactical and psychosocial as well as physical, where you've got like the representative learning design, with it's 100%. There's going to be very chaotic, especially in an invasion game like soccer or basketball or something along them lines, where there's decision-making process going on, so it looks messy. The problem is if it's always 100% representative learning, yeah, they're going to learn the process, but they might not be able to refine their skills well enough, and they've got then to be taken into a more controlled environment. And then that's where, as a coach, we can use more linear pedagogy, or more kind of block learning, where it's more rote learning, where you kind of tell them, no, this is how you're going to do it, this is how you're going to improve it, and it's very structured. But the process is then just flitting between the two, and how long you spend in one versus the other. And I see traditionally, I remember as a coach going through my own coach education development, was we have to start with a technical drill, then we go into a skill drill where there's a little bit of pressure, then we go into a small sided game, then we go into a bigger game. And one of the things that I learned was like, why does it always have to be in that chronological order? Why does it have to be in that order all the time? Why can't we start with the bigger game, go into a technical element, then go into a small-sided game, then go into a more skill-based, like 1v1, 2v2, then go back to the big game? Why does it? And again, I think they've found that there's more research with teaching games for understanding, which is a great concept of how then we can utilize different coaching methods in a session to help the athletes learn. But again, it comes from that teaching process. If the teacher does the same starter quiz at the same every single session, and I think we use Kahoot a little bit, so like they might use a Kahoot quiz, right? You might have heard of them. If you do that every single session, there's no impact on there eventually. It's like when you do the same warm-up all the time. Yeah, there's a benefit to doing the same warm-up because you get into the same mindset, you get into this routine, but then people start going through the motions when they notice the same thing. Mm-hmm. So as a coach and a teacher, you got to flit things up. And again, it's having that self-awareness of when it's time to flit it up, when it's time to change and adapt, when it's time to do it structured, when it's time to be messy. And the ultimate, though, and this is where I think kind of the process for me is a little bit of a light bulb moment. Deciding when to do it is not for the sake of it or not based on what the coach's needs or wants. It's got to be based on the athletes. So if your team need more decision-making processes, put them in more decision-making processes. If an athlete needs some more individual technical skills, right, we're going to do some individual technical skills and we're going to give them specifics. And I think the beauty of it is that, and I think about the same as a teacher, if you've got this time slot where you've got your athletes, you can do whatever you want in that time slot, but can they be better from when they come into that time slot to when they leave that time slot. So if you have an hour and a half to do a soccer session, can you make them better by the end of that session related to an aim or an objective that you have? And it might just be one little thing. It might be one objective or one aim. And I think that's one thing that I'm conscious of as a coach as well. And again, as a teacher, right? If you think about teaching and how that element can help a coach, normally you go in with an aim and an objective and they all interlink. The biggest gripe I've got about youth basketball is the fact that basketball coaches try to cover everything whatsoever in their practices. You always start with layup lines. You always do a defensive closeout drill. You always do spot shooting drills. Then you always do some shell defensive drill. Then you might do some 3-on-2, 2-on-1 transition. And then you end up with a 5-on-5 scrimmage. All them things are kind of so many different elements of basketball. Yeah, they're all important. But as a coach, can't you just make one of them important and just do drills related on that? So if you're going to do defending, everything in that session should be aimed to defending. So why are you doing layup lines? Unless you're putting a defender on how to stop the layup or pressure the layup or close the lane off or whatever it is. But basketball coaches don't think like that. And that's one thing that
there probably are some out there.
Of course, yeah. I'm just generalizing because that's what I've seen through coaches here, where you go and watch a basketball session and they have these elements of a specific structure that is just embedded into that gear, into that sport. And one thing, what's really interesting is as a teacher, you have an aim and objective. As a coach, you have an aim and objective. Is that aim and objective coming out through you intentionally running your activities the way that you're supposed to run them activities? And I think if coaches understand that a little bit, then that aim and that objective has to be related to the athlete need, not just what the coach needs to do, because it's covering something, as you just highlighted.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important element of how we can develop coaches more effectively. And it's easy for a young coach as well. If you have one aim or one objective, and that's the only thing that you focus on, and everything revolves around that aim and objective, as a young coach with maybe less experience, you're not then overwhelmed. You're just, right, this is the only thing I'm focused on. This is the thing I'm helping. Then next session, we'll move on to another aim or another objective.
No, 100%. Because I was going to say, isn't that where expertise comes in, where you might have your lesson plan, whether it's teaching or coaching, you have your lesson plan, but the more expertise you have, the more ability you have to deviate from that plan based on the feedback that you're getting from your athletes or your students. But you're right. Like for the more novice coach or teacher, all the more reason to have a solid plan because you're more likely to be following that to a T.
And I think as well in that expertise, though, even a high-level expert coach could then use that same aim and objective, but then really have, and going back to like kind of the coach I mentioned about that kind of finer detail, that's where we can really start developing that finer detail in that X's and O's concepts, where if you're focused on, say on basketball, you focus on shell defense. Like if everything in that session is related to shell defense and you're going in and you're progressing it and everything's related to it, the players are then going to be better off from when they first came into when they leave in shell defense. If that's a preparation for a game and you want your defense to be better on the perimeter or force on the perimeter, whatever it might be, all of a sudden then you're going to impact your players there. And you'll know that next game is, right, this is my target. Can we be better from a defensive process to keep people on the perimeter, shoot on from the perimeter more, less chance of scoring points. We've got better defense. They score less points. We score more points. Now, great. Now we're starting winning games. Now we move on to the next element. And again, from that process, that's where, even though you've got the higher expertise, which I totally agree with, that you can deviate based on your player needs and your understanding, that higher expertise can go on where you can really drill down on that finite issue where you go, right, now all my session is going to be related to this one aim and objective, but you're going to learn so much in this because we're going to create an environment for you to learn.
Right. And there would be a much deeper understanding because you're hitting it from so many different perspectives. And as you mentioned earlier, the whole like learning styles, not everybody learns the same way at the same time. So hit as many as you can. We are running out of time. I did have one random question. Tell me about this Ohio University Coach Education Club.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is a student-led club that is part of our program. So every year we recruit students. I'm like the faculty advisor for it. So I then help the president and the vice president create educational sessions for those members based on some of the things that we may not cover in class. So over the last few years, we've had sports psychologists come in and talk about kind of a specific issue that they're dealing with in the collegiate environment. So we're fortunate to use our coaches here at OU, and where they can come in and basically present to the group of the students that are members. We actually brandished it so it won't just be undergrad, it was grad and undergrad, and it was also for our online students. So we started having these sessions through remote Teams and Zooms, and we was able to then create a bit of a process where being a member of this club allows you to get further coaching education based on a specific topic or a specific area of interest that our club members have that they can learn from that might not be taught in as much detail in the classes. So we've been doing that for 6-7 years now, and we run a session a semester.
Cool, cool. Well, is there anything else you would like to share that I haven't not asked about already?
I think from my perspective, I just appreciate you inviting me, and I just come from a different perspective from a coach education background. And one of the things that my passion is, hopefully came across in this podcast, is the impact you're trying to have with coaches. Obviously, I'm doing it through a degree process where the students here at Ohio University have an opportunity to learn from our curriculum, learn from our professors, our faculty, and I'm able to give that perspective to those individuals in these degrees where they may not have an understanding of what it's like from the UK and Europe, but then also me coming into this environment and loving the American way of sports and the organization of sports out here to really influence these young coaches or future coaches to have an opportunity to get into an environment and impact the youth of tomorrow. I think that's the biggest thing. And I think I'll finish with this is I feel like I'm a stone that gets dropped into a pond, and it's like a ripple effect. So you have the first ring of the ripple, and they're the students that I'm impacting. And then I hope that those coaches that I'm impacting go and coach some students that then have a positive impact on them. And then that'll continue to happen. So I know that I'm trying to fight a fight utilizing a small town in Athens, Ohio, but also we know that there are more people out here in the US that are on the same wavelength as myself and you included, that we're trying to educate coaches in different ways, and basically trying to educate coaches so that we reduce this 70% youth athletes that quit sports, and also try to give more developmental nurturing coaching to these athletes that might then become even better and then might even get into a further position in that elite level, whether it's high school to collegiate to professional, or whether it's just high school to professional, depending on the sport and depending on the different pathways. But ultimately, as coaches, we're using the vehicle of sport to impact these individuals psychosocially to be better leaders, better people, better with their soft skills. And that's where it comes as us as role models as a coach, to be able to portray those skills effectively by being good leaders, good managers, and definitely having a self-awareness where we're impacting people more positively.
Well, I'm sure just based on this one conversation with you that you are having that effect and that you are starting that ripple. I can't imagine it's not happening. So
I
good for you.
appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you're walking away with some new knowledge and something to reflect on. And if this episode resonated with you, please consider sharing it with a friend or subscribing on your favorite platform. Until next week, take care, and thanks for listening to Sport Coach Education.